My talk is called Lucky, Good, or Both, and the answer is yes. So you can all go home now and be content with what you've learned today. But what I want to start is by talking about this idea that we exist now in a world in which the value of talent has supposedly never been higher. So we live in what is sometimes called a free agent economy, where people move freely from one institution to another, from one corporation to another, from one hedge fund to another, or whatever, and in which the value of high-profile talent has never been more expensive in terms of what people are willing to pay for it, and in terms of the importance that they place on it. So the idea is if you can hire a few right people, that actually can transform your organization, that can actually make a huge difference. We also are now investing a huge amount of energy in trying to evaluate talent. So we spend an enormous amount of money in our corporations on human resources. When it comes to teachers, as many of you know, that has become a huge issue, teacher evaluation. The LA Times recently published the results of the teacher evaluations of all the teachers in the LA area in order to kind of produce a picture of who was successful and who wasn't. And we have some kind of faith that we actually are able to do this reasonably effectively. And we also have a faith that the fine distinctions we make in these kind of using these talent evaluation tools make a profound difference to our bottom line or to what happens in our schools and the like. What I want to talk about today is not the idea that talent is irrelevant. So one counter to the concept that talent is really what matters is that, in effect, everything is kind of random. This is sort of associated with people like Nassim Taleb and Leonard Mlodinow, who have written books like Fooled by Randomness and The Drunkard's Walk, in which they argue that much of the time, and perhaps even most of the time, kind of chance essentially determines our fate. It's sort of like that quote from Ecclesiastes where he says, "I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all." The fundamental thesis of this talk is that it is absolutely true that time and chance happens to all of us, and that it does make a profound difference in the outcomes that we enjoy much of the time. But nonetheless, that the quest to try to determine whether talent exists and who is more talented than someone else is not necessarily a futile one. And that talent can, and this is perhaps will seem obvious, make a huge difference in the performance of an organization, an institution, and even arguably a country. The problem, I think, is that our notion of talent is somewhat skewed. I think what I will end up arguing is something to the effect that we simultaneously overrate and underrate talent. There's a good counterintuitive conclusion for you. And that this has really profound consequences, both for the way we evaluate talent, the way we hire, and the way we sort of pay people. So that's kind of where I'm going to end up going. But I actually want to start with this idea of chance, because chance is actually very important. It plays a huge role, obviously, in outcomes. And it's something that when we evaluate talent, we tend to profoundly underrate. So we actually tend to underestimate how important chance is. And I think this has is a big part of why we oftentimes do a bad job in hiring, recruiting, or the like. So there's a study by 3 social scientists, including Duncan Watts, who's a friend of mine, which is why I mentioned his name. And they did this study where they were trying to evaluate the relationship between the quality of a pop song and the actual outcome in terms of the popularity of that pop song. And so what they did was they set up this experiment where they basically invited people in, and they actually had a wide range of pop songs that basically no one had ever heard before, and that were not produced by anyone that you would have heard of. Nonetheless, in this collection of songs, there were some that were presumably better than others. And then they just basically ran a series of experiments over and over again in which they kind of just asked people to listen to these songs and rate them. Okay? So they did this a couple ways. One of the ways they did it was they just did it a kind of pure, you just listened to the songs and you came up with your own ratings and basically ended up coming up with whatever you thought were the best songs. And then they just ranked them according to those ratings. But then they tweaked the experiment in an important way. And what they did was they basically assigned about 20% of the people to what they called worlds, where you could see what other people were doing. So in other words, you listened to your songs and you rated them, but before you rated the songs, you could also see what other people had done. In other words, you could see how often they had downloaded the song, how often they had streamed it, and the like. And then they waited to see what happened in those cases. Then people ended up doing the rankings, and they waited to see what happened. Now, if the influence of other people basically had kind of no effect on us, you would expect that the rankings in these two different variants of the experiment would be the same. But in fact, they were profoundly different. In the first experiment, we can assume that the best songs kind of ended up rising to the surface. But in the second experiment, a song that was rated in the top 5 in the kind of pure quality thing only had about a 50% chance of finishing in the top 5. And one song, which was 26th basically in the the independent world, ended up number 1 in one of these social influence worlds. But in another world, it ended up number 40 essentially. So there was a really wide variation in the actual outcomes, a variation that was in some way independent of the actual quality of the song. It's not that quality was irrelevant, because the best song did end up in the top 5 about 50% of the time, and there was a kind of rough connection between what people thought of as quality and the actual outcomes. But that connection was very, very loose. Chance, which in this case took the form of basically the influence that other people exerted on your choices, ended up having a profound effect on the actual outcomes of these songs. And so you could argue that something very similar is at work, say, in why certain Hollywood stars are more famous than others and the like. It's not, again, that talent is irrelevant to why, say, Bruce Willis became a huge star, but it's also the case that the social influence and chance helps determine why someone goes from being a bartender, which is what Bruce Willis was, to being a huge success. Now, the same thing is at work also in the corporate world. So back in 1950, the economist Armin Alchian offered a kind of parable where you might about how to think about luck. And what he said, imagine that you had thousands of people in Chicago, and they basically were setting out from Chicago to travel around the country, and they were basically choosing their destinations and the routes they were going to take completely at random. Okay, so they basically were all going out. And let's say we frame this as kind of a contest. So the person who got to his destination most quickly was going to be seen as basically having won the contest. Then Alchian said, imagine that on all of these different routes, all of these different roads out of Chicago, there was only one road that actually had a gas station on it. Now, what was going to happen? Well, one person who left Chicago basically was going to make it to where they were going, and everybody else was going to end up stranded by the side of the road. Now, you could say that this one person basically was especially talented at picking his route or the like, but the reality is, of course, that it was just chance. He just happened to be on the right road that had the right gas station. Now, the metaphor Alchian said is that if you think about an economy, and in an economy, you have all these different companies trying lots of different things to appeal to customers. You have lots of different companies out there trying to invent new kinds of products, to sell them in new kinds of ways, and the like. And in any economy that is big enough and diverse enough, where people are going to be trying lots of different things, you're going to have some companies that end up hitting on the right solution. Now, it may be that they hit on the right solution because they're geniuses or because they're enormously talented or the like. But it may also be that they just hit on the right solution because, in effect, they were like the traveler that chose to go to Indianapolis instead of Des Moines, basically. And so chance plays a huge role in business as well. And you can see the exact same phenomenon at work in coin flips. So this is sort of a famous example. And so if I asked all of you to kind of flip a coin, actually I don't know how many we are here, but if I asked all of you to flip a coin, say 10 times or 6 or 7 times, In a crowd this big, I'm not sure if it actually would work in a crowd this big, but it might work in a crowd this big. In a crowd this big, there's a good chance that someone would flip a coin heads 5 or 6 times in a row, basically, right? And we could say if that happened, and in fact, when you do this experiment in classes, people do in fact say you must have some crazily eccentric coin flipping skill, basically. That you have somehow figured out how to rest the coin on your thumb in some special way and basically flip it in some unique manner that ends up, so that the coin ends up turning up heads. But the reality, of course, is that this is just randomness. If you have a large enough sample and you do a task over and over again, there's a good chance that at least 1 or 2 people are going to end up succeeding in a really useful way. And so again there, our desire is to kind of ascribe meaning to that. Our desire is to assume that something big is going on, something true is happening, when in fact it's just luck that's basically triumphing. And this problem is compounded by the fact that there are these sort of problems that we succumb to that end up influencing our view of talent. So let me tell you a story about the company Airbus. So as many of you know, there are essentially 2 giant aviation companies in the world. One is Airbus and the other is Boeing. So about 3 or 4 years ago, everyone was really concerned about the plummeting fortunes of Airbus. It had staked its future on this huge jet, a super jumbo jet called the A380. I don't know if any of you have ever ridden it. It's pretty extraordinary. And people were sort of wondering, does anyone really want to fly on a plane that seats 600 people and it takes like an hour to load the plane, basically, and the like. The A380s that had been ordered were going to be delivered late. They had another project that was going on that was being completely redesigned. And at the same time, Boeing seemed to be completely in the ascendance because it had designed this new jet called the Dreamliner, the 787 Dreamliner, which was this very sleek, kind of smaller, lighter plane that was going to use less fuel and the like. And in the first half of, I guess it was 2004, Boeing got like 500 new orders for its planes, and Airbus took about 117. So as a result of this, if you actually looked at what the business press said, what the business press said was that this was evidence that there was something fundamentally wrong with the way Airbus's business worked. So Airbus, as you may know, was started by an alliance of European countries. And governments actually play a role in how Airbus works. And it gave them access to government-subsidized loans, but it also meant that they had this kind of responsibility to the government. So the Wall Street Journal said this was evidence that Airbus was failing because of politicized management. The New York Times said it had to decide between being a company and an employment project and the like. And so the idea was that essentially Airbus's problems told us something important about whether or not Airbus was good at what it was doing. But the paradox was that just a few years before, everything had been kind of flipped on its head. Airbus was being exalted in the late 1990s and in 2001 as this kind of genius combination of government subsidies and corporate structure. Because it was kind of insulated from the stock market, it was essentially, it had the ability to invest in long-term research and development, where Boeing was subject to the sort of whipsawing effect of having to satisfy angry shareholders. Boeing looked like it was trapped also in a kind of cost-cutting mentality because somebody said the money guys don't reward long-term thinking and investment. And just a couple years earlier, Businessweek had said Boeing was choking on Airbus's fumes. So at that time, 2-3 years earlier, Boeing's failures were seen as kind of evidence of their truth. The truth is that both of these things were more likely the result of chance than they were anything else. And the reason we tend to sort of try to ascribe these truths is a result of a couple biases that human beings have. The first is that we're really subject to what's usually called the law of small numbers. And you can see this at work anytime you go to the casino. If you go to a casino and you're at the craps table or at the roulette table, what you'll see happen is that people will essentially ascribe meaning to 2 or 3 results. So a few results will we'll assume that basically we can judge from that what actually is happening. We tend to derive way too much meaning from very, very small sample sizes. The other thing that's true is we're also subject to something called the recency bias. So this is kind of obvious, but in fact it ends up being quite powerful, which is to say things that have happened most recently, things that are very prominent in our minds, tend to have an inordinate impact on our evaluation of what actually is going on. So that instead of doing what might seem logical, so looking at kind of the long-term impact of the long-term sort of performance or looking at performance over time, what we tend to do instead is to rely on things that are very prominent and very available in our minds. And that's why if you actually read the business press, and I'm sure if you read some of my columns, you'd find the exact same effect at work, what you see is these kind of really swings in conventional wisdom. So that depending on what's happened in the last 6 months or the last year, people's attitudes about what is true end up changing quite dramatically. Now, this is actually really excellent for management consultants because what it does is it creates this great appetite for fads. So whatever the new thing is, essentially, can be seen not just as, it's useful right now, it's actually kind of a truth about the world. The classic example of this is in 1982 when Tom Peters and Bob Waterman published a book called In Search of Excellence. So I want to actually ask a question. I can't really say anything, but how many of you remember In Search of Excellence or have you even heard of it? Oh, so all right. So this is testament to the power of these books. So In Search of Excellence, in a way, that's not surprising because In Search of Excellence is really kind of a legendary management book. In fact, arguably, it's really perhaps the most influential management book ever published, with the possible exception of Jim Collins' Built to Last. And the story behind In Search of Excellence is very interesting. It was published in 1982 at a time that in some ways felt a little bit like right now. So people were really ridden by anxiety about the United States economy. People were really convinced that the U.S. had lost its edge, particularly in manufacturing, but really that we had kind of lost our ability to dominate in the world economy. It was a time when there was a tremendous fad for Japanese management books, things like Theory Z and the Art of Japanese Management. People were really convinced that they had figured something out that we had not. And what Peters and Waterman did was write a book that essentially argued that this was wrong, that actually there were American companies, there were 43 they featured in the book, that had kind of figured out the key to success. And, so this was a book not just about kind of what worked in business, it was also a book about what could kind of work for America. And so what they did was they looked at companies that had enjoyed some success, and they basically sort of went and visited them and tried to come up with some conclusions based on what these companies had done. And to say this is really the key. They went in search of excellence, and they came back and said that they had found it. And they found 8 attributes that they said defined corporate excellence. They were things like pretty vague things, although some of them I think actually are probably quite useful. Things like a bias for action rather than inertia. Seems fairly obvious. Staying close to the customer, being loose and tight at the same time. And then the one that probably was sort of most famous was that these companies stuck to their knitting, so that instead of being kind of somewhat wide-ranging in what they tried to do, they were very focused and they were very consistent in what they did. Now, In Search of Excellence was enormously influential, enormously popular. I mean, it made both of them millionaires, although only Tom Peters really became famous. And there were definitely companies in the book In Search of Excellence that were in fact excellent and that over time have remained enormously successful, like Johnson & Johnson and 3M and the like. But what's also true is that when people later went back and looked at those 43 companies, what they found was that there was no consistency in how they performed after In Search of Excellence was published. There were a number of those companies ended up going completely out of business. Atari, for instance, was one of the In Search of Excellence companies. And many of them just fell back into mediocrity. And in a way, this wasn't surprising. for a couple of reasons. The first is that the way Peters and Waterman picked the companies in Search of Excellence was not by any rigorous kind of statistical system. What they did instead was they worked at McKinsey, was they just went around the offices at McKinsey and said, what companies do you think are good? Now, so I wrote this book called The Wisdom of Crowds, and given what I wrote in that book, that's probably not a terrible way of doing it, but it's obviously also not the best way of doing it. And it's not a way that's going to guarantee in any way that you really are picking truly excellent companies. The other problem, and this is the more important one, obviously, is that Peters and Waterman really failed to take into account at all the reality of mean reversion. So mean reversion, as you know, is an incredibly powerful force, which is to say that in general, companies, individuals, athletes, corporate performers, CEOs, they do tend to have some natural level, let's call it, of ability or whatever it is. But around that level of ability, there can be enormous variation. And so from year to year, just let's take athletes, which is the easiest example, because athletes we all assume, I think, have some natural level of talent. Even the best athletes will have bad years, and even mediocre athletes will oftentimes have exceptionally good years. Now, it's not true that mediocre athletes will have exceptionally good years, so at the very end of the spectrum, but you see a really wide range of variation. And that's in an environment in which we assume that talent has an enormous amount to do with outcomes, which is sports. In other environments where chance and sort of the environment, the kind of business environment, et cetera, have even a bigger impact, the effect of that variation can be much wider even. And what we also know is that as a result of that variation, people tend to revert to the mean, right? So if you have a really exceptional year, it's much more likely you're going to fall back to whatever your average level is. Peters and Waterman basically completely disregarded this. And so what seems clear is that a lot of the truly excellent companies they were picking were just companies that had a few years of good performance and then eventually kind of fell back to where they actually went. But we have a very, very hard time kind of accepting these concepts. Another classic example would be the late 1990s. I mean, if you think about the late 1990s, you had technology companies that were seen as essentially the future, and where they were essentially going to keep increasing their profits year after year at rates that had never been seen before. And you also had companies like, let's take the most famous one, Enron, which were seen as paragons of management excellence. So if you go back to 1999, it's actually very hard to find a business book that in one way or another didn't hold up Enron as a great example of something or other. There were a lot of different things it was supposedly a great example of, but it was Fortune's most innovative company like 5 years in a row. And there were reasons for this. I mean, I remember being at a conference at which Jeff Skilling, who was the CEO of Enron, spoke in like 1999. And he was a very convincing guy. He was someone who, when you listened to him, it sounded like he really knew what he was talking about. But again, this was people really essentially taking a very small sample size. Enron had really only been around for a few years. And also, in some important sense, kind of disregarding the context in which all these events were happening and drawing massive conclusions from it. Now, the problem is that this is something that is very, very hard to get rid of. Because our desire to attribute results to innate talent or innate ability turns out to be, in some ways, probably innate itself. In general, we are terrible at accepting the importance of context and chance. And there are probably good reasons for it. It's very disconcerting to accept a world in which chance plays a major role. And understanding context actually turns out to be harder than you might think it is. And so we tend to fall prey to what the social psychologist Lee Ross called the fundamental attribution error. Now, when he called it the fundamental attribution error, what he meant was that it was kind of the fundamental mistake we all made, that it was kind of ubiquitous. And it's very hard to get rid of. But it also is a kind of error about fundamentals, if you think about it. It's also an error in the sense of we sort of assume that innate ability trumps all else. Now, the interesting thing about this is, set aside this question of randomness, We do this even in situations where context would seem to be overwhelmingly important. So one classic demonstration is that you take people and you show them a video of two people. One guy is shooting a basketball in a gym with very, very poor lighting, so it's kind of dark, basically. And another person is shooting a basketball in a gym, you know, beautiful college gym, great lighting and the like. The person shooting the basketball in the gym with the excellent lighting, not surprisingly, hits more of his shots than the other guy does. But when you ask people to evaluate which of the two people, of the two shooters, is better, people overwhelmingly say that the shooter who was shooting in the gym with the excellent lights was a better shooter. That is to say, that he had more ability. They essentially kind of disregard the context in which those shots take place. We do this even in odder situations as well. So the first experiment that was done to kind of demonstrate this error was in the 1960s. And what they did was they brought people into a room and they had them listen to people give kind of speeches, or essentially they were essays, but they were basically reading essays. But they were essentially speeches. So some of the speeches were pro-Castro and some of them were anti-Castro. And the people in the audience were essentially told that the people giving the speeches had not written them, that they were basically sort of following instructions and the like. But afterwards, when they asked people to evaluate the political views of the people who gave the speeches, they again overwhelmingly said that the people that gave pro-Castro speeches were pro-communist, and the people who gave anti-Castro speeches were anti-communist. In a similar kind of experiment, what they did was they basically assigned people to be either questioners or contestants in a quiz show. And then they asked an audience to just watch this. But the way the quiz show worked was, if you were the questioner, you could ask the contestant any trivia question you wanted, right? So you could basically rack your brain for, there were some boundaries, but essentially you could ask them almost anything about, you know, whatever, the scientific nature of mushrooms or whatever it was, basically. And if you were a contestant, you just essentially, you know, hoped you knew the answer to these somewhat random questions. And it was 10 questions, and the questioners were actually were told, you know, ask these questions in an area in which you are knowledgeable, basically. And then they asked people, you know, just to watch, and they told them what the setup was. So they said the questioner knows, you know, can ask about things that he knows a lot about. The contestants are just essentially assigned at random. Now, what happened? Well, predictably enough, the contestants did very poorly on these questions. And then they asked the observers, the people in the audience, to rate the questioners and the answerers on an intelligence, you know, to rate their intelligence, essentially. And again, not surprisingly, they basically said, oh, well, the questioners are much smarter than the contestants are. Now, there are ways you can kind of, if you want to ask me about this in Q&A, there's some interesting problems with that particular experiment. You could say, well, people just assume that you know, with the Castro thing, you know, why would they accept the assignment if they weren't kind of pro-communist in some way or whatever? But both of these are examples of people really disregarding context in kind of important ways. And what's interesting is that you see this same phenomenon at work in experiments that are essentially get rid of any problems like that. So in 1996, they did this experiment where basically they put people into two groups. Two kinds of groups. One of the groups was made up of 2 people, and the other one was made up of 10 people. Okay, and the task they were being asked to solve was what are sometimes called a coordination problem. I won't go into the details of it, but essentially the goal was to get people to cooperate. If you cooperated with each other, you would both end up better than if you didn't cooperate. But there was an incentive for any one person to defect, because if you defected, you know, in other words, to not help other people, because if you didn't help, you would actually reap greater benefits and, you know, not have to contribute and blah, blah, blah. So in any experiment like this, it's pretty clear that it's a lot easier to get people to cooperate if there are only 2 of you rather than if there are 10 of you, right? It's pretty straightforward. And this was made clear, again, to the observers. So then what they did was they assigned one person in each group to be the leader, and they gave the person a speech that was designed to inspire cooperation in the group. basically. Okay. So now, with the two-people group, that just meant that one guy said to the other guy, you know, come on, we need to get it together here and work together. But in the 10-person group, the leader got up and blah, blah, blah. Now, not surprisingly, again, in the 10-person group, the inspirational speech had almost no effect. So those groups had a very hard time coordinating. It's very hard to get people to work together if you have 10 people and it's in the individual incentive of each one of them not to cooperate and the like. But in the 2-person group, they almost all ended up cooperating because it was pretty obvious and easy to figure out. But when they asked people who watched these experiments to rate the leaders on leadership ability and inspirationalness or whatever, everyone said the leaders in the 2-person groups were much better and much better leaders than everyone else. Okay, so the last experiment that I'll tell you about this was actually even more peculiar in a way because it actually involved hiring. And what they did was they said, you know, essentially asked people to play the role of a boss and working for a company in which there was this given task that people had to do. It was a very simple task. It basically involved deriving anagrams from a 4-letter word or from a 5-letter word, essentially. So, you know, they're 4-letter anagrams, and you had to figure out what the actual word was. And then there were also 5-letter anagrams, and you had a limited amount of time to answer it. So obviously much easier to solve a 4-letter anagram than a 5-letter anagram in a limited amount of time. People playing the bosses saw this. They understood how the game worked. They saw the results. And the groups were distributed randomly, so no one was better at it, necessarily inherently better. And then they asked employers, okay, here's your pool. You know, you can hire any of these people. And you also, you know, can decide whether or not you'd pay certain people more than others. And we'd also like to know your predictions about how well each of these people will do going forward in this anagram solving task, basically. And they set it up so that it was actually a recurring game. So employers had an opportunity to learn. They actually got feedback. They had more experience with what was going on. Nonetheless, the people playing the bosses predicted that the people who they saw doing the easy task and who therefore were more successful would do 20% better on any task in the future. And that they were willing to pay 10% more to hire those people, basically. Now, if you think about it, this is quite extraordinary. I mean, it actually means that, in effect, what we do is block out the world around us. And instead, we try and assume that there is a kind of truth that we can, in some sense, see. And we also assume that performance, regardless of the factors that shape it, tells us something fundamental that we can rely on about the people who are actually performing. So there are really interesting consequences to this. One is that grade inflation probably works. So if you actually go to a school where grades are higher across the board, it actually is unlikely that admissions committees are really going to take that fully into account in making decisions about you. And in fact, there actually have been studies of admissions committees which suggest that admissions committees do not really fully account for the effects of grade inflation on the people that they are actually admitting into colleges. The other thing it suggests, obviously, is that if you are a CEO in a certain kind of industry in which chance happens to favor you or the environment happens to favor you, that people are not going to take that fully into account in judging your ability. And that is, in fact, the case. So oil company executives, for instance, end up getting paid significantly more when oil prices rise than in other circumstances, even though they have, conspiracy theories aside, they have nothing to do with whether or not oil prices actually go up or down. And, of course, with CEOs, the effect is all on the upside. They are not paid less when oil prices drop, of course. But and this also has really interesting effects kind of obviously on politics. So it's one reason why presidents, for instance, are obviously rewarded or punished based on what's happening in the economy, even though they oftentimes have very little impact on what actually is happening in the economy. in the corporate world, it also essentially industry is kind of irrelevant. So if you're an industry in which you happen to be like the tech industry in the late 1990s, in which things are rising, in which everything is kind of rising, you're likely to be exceptionally well paid merely because you're essentially in a good industry. If you're in a poor industry, you're likely to be paid more poorly, even if you are. Even if your individual performance is actually quite good. So we underestimate circumstance and we overestimate innate ability. And this problem is compounded by the fact that we are also subject to what I call the kind of seduction of the good face. So the good face is an expression that comes from Moneyball, from Michael Lewis's book about Billy Beane. And that whole book is really about how can you actually separate kind of ability from chance, how can you separate ability from things that seem like they have something to do with performance but actually have nothing to do with it, or the like. And the metaphor of the good face is basically that's the way scouts oftentimes talk about baseball players that they like. When they're trying to explain why they think that a team should draft this player, they'll often say, he has a good face. And Billy Beane, who was the general manager of the Oakland A's, himself had a very good face. He's a very good-looking guy. And he also, more importantly, had a great kind of baseball body. He was it looked like he was incredibly skilled. The only problem was that he actually ended up being pretty much unable to hit. And so he ended up, despite looking like everything you would want in a baseball player, actually being a pretty poor player. And he, unlike most of us, actually learned from this experience and basically said that instead of kind of evaluating people based on what they look like or things that we think are relevant but actually are irrelevant, we need to try to remove that kind of subjective dimension and look at sort of objective dimensions in terms of performance. But as it happens, the good face has a big impact in a lot of different places. So many of you probably know that height has an inordinate influence on politics. It has an inordinate influence in the corporate world and like. If you actually look at the correlation between height and sort of where you stand in the corporate ladder, taller people tend to go further. In most elections, the taller president tends to win and the like. Now, people have tried to come up with arguments about why this might be the case, but the obvious one is simply that people who are tall look like what we expect leaders to look like, and therefore we assume that they are actually going to do a better job than they actually are. In the NFL, paradoxically, where you might think like physical ability has everything to do with it, the NFL has a combine every year where they basically have people try out and they run the 40 and they lift weights and everything like that. And the strange thing is that there's almost no correlation actually between the performance in the combine and actual performance on the field. And yet the combine does actually have an impact on how we end up drafting. So we are subject to all of these factors that end up influencing us. And I think it's one of the reasons why actually forecasting ability ends up being much harder than perhaps it should be. And it's probably why something like 30 to 50% of all executive hires end up either in firing or in resignation. And it's why, in general, exceptional performance is not something that people are very, very good at predicting. So now let's get to this question of does talent exist? So one conclusion you can draw from all this is essentially that there is no way to try to understand in any way in advance or to separate kind of ability and skill from luck or from context. So, and yet at the same time, we know kind of intuitively that talent must exist, right? We know there is a sense in which some people are just better than others at certain kinds of tasks. It's easy to see in some circumstances, right? I mean, in sports, in tennis, it's very easy to see. And we know that there's a kind of spectrum. So there's some pursuits where luck probably has very little impact, if any. So chess would be the obvious example. And we know that there are other pursuits in which luck has essentially all of an impact. So roulette, right? I mean, there are people who think they're great roulette players, but in reality, there aren't, essentially, right? So, but the challenge for us, obviously, is that most of the things we care about, most of the things that are relevant to our lives, to our business lives, or our political lives, to our individual lives, our work lives, are somewhere in between, right? So we assume that skill and luck have some kind of impact, and the question is essentially how do you disentangle them? Now, one way to think about whether or not, just to figure out in advance, is skill at all relevant is a way that my friend Michael Mauboussin, who works for Legg Mason Capital Management, has come up with. And the way he says is when you're thinking about a task, ask yourself, can I do badly at this? Okay, deliberately. Can I deliberately fail at this task? And if you can deliberately fail, that implies that there probably is some skill involved, right? You can't deliberately do badly at craps, right? It's not possible, right? I mean, you can bet badly, but you can't deliberately roll against yourself or something like that, right? But other tasks, like obviously tennis, it's very easy to play badly in tennis. And the interesting question, but it starts to get interesting when you think about things like investing, right? So if I asked all of you to go out and buy a bad portfolio of stocks, right? Do a bad job of investing your money. I mean, most of us have had experience with doing that, not deliberately, but think about it. I mean, could you go out and deliberately assemble a bad portfolio of stocks? You probably could, right? You probably could at least give yourself a good chance of losing a lot of money. You might buy stocks that have incredibly high price-to-earnings ratios, or you might buy stocks that have criminals running them or things like that. I mean, there are things you could probably do that would improve your chances of doing badly. But the interesting thing is that you would not be guaranteed of doing badly. In fact, everything we know about investment performance suggests that there would actually be a chance that things would turn out exceptionally well for you. That the high price-earning ratio companies would turn out to have those because, in fact, they were growing and going to keep growing exceptionally fast. And the companies that were run by seeming crooks would fire the crook, and then we'd have mean reversion, and they would end up doing exceptionally well. So investing does have some skill involved, but it probably doesn't have. It's probably not a huge amount of skill in some ways. Luck probably plays a very big role. Business is another interesting example, right? So if I asked you to go out and run a business into the ground, you could probably do it, right? I mean, you could probably do it. But if I asked you, okay, let's assume you're going to at least do the normal things, like you're going to meet your payroll and you're going to, you're not going to hire people who are essentially obviously criminals or whatever, and essentially you're going to try to run the company reasonably well, but you're going to try to make bad strategic choices. You're going to try to invest in products that you think are going to fail. You're going to do a poor job of sales and the like. We kind of assume that you could probably run the company into the ground if you wanted. But it's probably also true that what you did would not on its own determine all of the results of that company. So if you were an oil company and oil prices rose sharply while you were trying to destroy the company, you would probably still end up making quite a bit of money. Essentially, if a product you invented happened by chance in the way that we talked about earlier to take off, against your best efforts, that company would still end up being profitable. So again, business too has this blend of skill, luck, and kind of circumstance or context, whatever you want to call it. So the question is, given this, are there ways we can actually try to think harder about separating out all of these different factors? There are a few things you can do. A couple that seem obvious and one that maybe doesn't seem quite that obvious. The first is obviously that you need to rely on as big a sample size as possible. That you need to make sure that you are not succumbing to the law of small numbers. So a lot of times when you see these studies that are done in academia of things like CEO performance or corporate performance, they're based on very short periods of time, 2-3 years, in which it's actually not very difficult, either for chance to just essentially elevate you, or for you to do certain things that end up boosting a company's performance in the short term but end up wrecking it in the long term. So you need to actually kind of expand your range of sample size. The second thing, which is more subtle, but I think actually from an intellectual point of view is necessary, is you want there to be, and this is sort of analogous to when you're trying to figure out, if a drug works, you want there to be some obvious connection in a theoretical sense between the skills that the people who you think are talented have and the performances they're enjoying. In other words, you want to be able to say it makes sense that someone who does this would also enjoy success. So the classic example here would be investing, right? So if you look at someone like Warren Buffett, who obviously has been enormously successful, people look at his success and say, yes, perhaps it's because he's enormously skilled, perhaps it's because, but perhaps it may just be, because he happened to get lucky. And what Buffett said is, actually, it's not just him, that people who share his characteristics, that is to say, value investing, long-term perspectives, patience, they don't trade a lot, and the like, that they tend to be more successful. And in fact, that is the case. So people who are trained in a certain kind of way of investing do tend to be more successful than those that don't. And if you think about it, there's a logic to it, right? I can make a plausible argument why someone who invests in this way will be more likely to be successful over time. The last thing I think you need to do, and this is the one that's perhaps not quite so obvious, is that you need to actually look for streaks. So you need to actually look for persistent success over time. Now, when we talk about streaks, everyone is streaky, right? So, again, this is the coin flip. A streak in and of itself does not actually demonstrate that you are exceptionally good. Sometimes, players essentially get the high hand and the like. But what we know about streaks is that the length of a streak and the frequency of streaks essentially matches almost perfectly onto ability. So what I mean by that is that mediocre players almost never have longer streaks than really, really great players. And the longest streaks are always of success, are always enjoyed by the best people. So if you look at baseball, there are no mediocre hitters who have had very long, say, hitting streaks. Joe DiMaggio is in the top 2% of all players and is also essentially has the 56-game hitting streak. Wilt Chamberlain obviously scored more points than anybody in the NBA in a given season, and he, not surprisingly, made more baskets in a row than any player in NBA history. Wayne Gretzky was the NHL's leading all-time scorer, and he holds the record for the most consecutive games in which he scored a point. And you can see this phenomenon over and over again. So looking at streaks, looking at the number of streaks and then looking how long they last actually turns out to be a very useful way of studying whether or not ability is real. So if something lasts over time, and if there are a number of long streaks, say in a big sample, say if in 25 years you have 2 long streaks of success, that suggests that actually there is some skill going on and some skill at work. And the reality is that when you actually do this, when you look at companies or when you look at, say, investors, and certainly when you look at athletes, what you actually find is that skill does, in fact, play a role. It plays a bigger role in sports, obviously, than it does in investing and in business, but it seems to play a role in both investing and in sort of the corporate world as well. The tricky thing is, though, that it only plays a role for a very small number of people. So if you actually look at the investing world, if you actually look at it over time, it seems like somewhere between 5 and maybe 8% of mutual fund investors actually have real ability. That is to say, the ability to actually outperform the market on a regular basis. 3/4 to 80% of funds basically give you no excess return at all. So you're really reaping no benefit at all for the extra money that you're paying them to manage your money. And then a larger percentage than of the successful ones are actually failures. So they actually are actively destroying your money when you give it to them, basically. In the business world, similarly, these 3 guys from Deloitte Consulting and the Texas School of Business did this kind of extraordinary study where what they did was they looked at something like 20,000 companies over 40 years. And what they were trying to figure out was, are there some companies that are actually more successful, that is to say better at whatever business they're doing, than other companies? And what they did was they basically looked at streaks in which companies were at the very top of the performance chart. So they divided the universe into 10 different deciles, right? And they said, are you in the top decile, the second, third, et cetera, et cetera? And they looked at how persistent performance was over time. And they did it in a very sophisticated way, so they accounted for the chance that, companies might move from one decile to another randomly and the like. They accounted for reversion to the mean, all of these things. And what they found was, in fact, there does seem to be some skill in running companies, or some companies at least tend to be better than others. But what they found was that of the 20,000 firms they evaluated, there were basically about 150 that seemed to actually be genuinely skilled, basically. So the number of firms that could actually do this is unbelievably small. Now, it's real. They are saying this is not just a result of chance. But it turns out that talent on that level is actually very, very rare. Now, the other thing about this kind of talent, though, is also that those who are talented enjoy enormously good results. So one of the things that is interesting about the spectrum of talent is that when we think about talent, what we think is, I think we generally think it exists kind of on a sort of straight level. So we can kind of evaluate people along the way, and there are that it's kind of a bell curve, essentially. And it kind of declines pretty smoothly. And so, you can kind of figure out where you are on the bell curve, and that will give you a sense. The reality actually seems in many cases to be different, which is to say that actually most people may be kind of pretty good at whatever the task is they're doing. And then there are a few people who are really, really terrible at it. And then there are a few people who are exceptionally good. And this is what I mean when I said earlier that I think talent is underrated. Because I think what we underrate is just how huge the difference is between those who are exceptionally good and everybody else. So you can actually see this kind of huge gap in a wide range of fields. In 1990, these three social scientists did a study, and they started out by looking at very simple tasks like assembly line workers and piece workers and the like. And what they found was that across a wide range of fields, the top 1% of workers were somewhere between 50% and 127% more productive than the average workers. And as jobs got more complex, that gap actually widened. So the more complex the job was, the more valuable the people at the very, very end of the spectrum were. And you can actually see the same effect in companies. So if you actually look at those companies that were successful, that they were able to say these companies are genuinely persistently performing better, their performance was massively greater than all of the other companies in the sample. So that actually what you see is that the returns to talent are actually much greater than you'd think if it were just a kind of bell curve. You can also see, they look at computer programmers. In computer programmers, above average programmers do about 320% more work or more productive than average programmers. And the very, very top performers, they're 1,200% more effective than average workers are. You can actually see the same thing at work in sports as well. So in baseball, actually, most players are not just average, they're slightly below average. Players that are at the very right end of the tail, that is, say, who are really, really above average, end up having an inordinate impact on the actual outcomes for team performance. And so, again, you have this kind of very curious thing in which instead of a bell curve, basically you have a much different distribution than you might normally expect. Now, I'm about to end. I'm sorry. But I want to complicate this picture one more time. And that is to say that when we think about talent, the last thing that we need to think about is that it's not just that circumstances matter in the sense of good lighting or bad lighting or whether or not we are being asked to be the questioner or the answer. It's that even if you accept that talent exists in the way that I'm arguing it does, it's the case that talent is context dependent in the sense that individual talents flourish better in some circumstances than others. They're better suited to some periods of history than others, to certain kinds of corporate environments than others. for me, the kind of quintessential example of this is Henry Ford. And so Henry Ford, obviously one of the great entrepreneurs in American business history, essentially invented the modern-day assembly line, transformed the way American companies paid their workers when he invented the $5 day on the assumption that if you paid your workers better, they would be more reliable and loyal, and they would also then be able to have enough money to buy your own products. He essentially pioneered what we later came to know as just-in-time production. A lot of the things we sort of associate with Toyota were actually introduced by Henry Ford in the 1920s. And he basically, in some important sense, kind of made America an automobile driving country with the Model T. And between, say, 1908, 1909, and the mid-1920s, Henry Ford was enormously successful. But in the late 1920s, then on into the Great Depression, the Ford Motor Company basically fell apart. It fell way behind General Motors, which eclipsed it. And in fact, Ford essentially hung around in the doldrums for about 20 years, as Henry Ford himself kind of surrounded himself with sycophants until he finally was forced out near the end of World War II. And they brought in these, what they called the whiz kids, to come in and transform the company. Now, what happened? So one explanation is it was just chance, basically. One explanation is that essentially Ford, had made the right choices early on, and then he made the wrong choices later, that it was kind of an Airbus-Boeing story. But I actually think a more plausible explanation is that Henry Ford's particular skill set was incredibly well suited to the early period of American automotive history and was very poorly suited to this kind of later period. And we can figure this out in a couple of ways. So what was Henry Ford's great invention? It was the Model T. And what was his famous saying about the Model T? You can have it or my customers can have it any color they want as long as it's black, basically, right? So Henry Ford's kind of model of the company-customer relationship was he made a product at a reasonable price, and you bought it. And you basically had no input into what he was going to do. And basically there was no desire on his part to have any kind of niche products, right? There was one product for the market as a whole. It was one market. And the reason he felt this way was that it worked for a long time. He said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted back in, 1904, they would have told me that they wanted a faster horse, essentially. That they essentially would not have been able to anticipate the car. But what Ford missed was that as American society transformed in the 1920s, as it became wealthier, as it became sort of more stratified in certain ways, and as consumerism took on more importance, people no longer wanted one car, basically. They no longer wanted a car that was one color. What they wanted was choice. And it was General Motors that kind of understood this. Because General Motors, although it was also obviously adept at producing, was much more adept, boy, those were the days away, much more adept at kind of listening to its customers. And so the General Motors model was a car for every purse and every wallet, essentially. So that depending on where you were on the income spectrum, you would own an Oldsmobile, or you would own a Buick, or you would own a Ford, or you would own a Cadillac. And you were able to buy those cars in many different colors. And so General Motors, Alfred Sloan's CEO, Alfred Sloan, just understood something about the new economy that Henry Ford didn't. And in a sense, Henry Ford was a dinosaur. His skill set was simply poorly adapted to the new world. Now, successful people have a very hard time accepting this idea, right? They have a very hard time accepting that environment matters. A classic example is Boris Groysberg's a professor at the Harvard Business School who did a really fascinating study of stock market analysts. And before he did the study, he interviewed them, and he spent a lot of time talking to them. And he asked them, does the place that you work now, the people you work with, the environment, the firm, the resources they offer you, does it have anything to do with how successful you are? 85% of them said it was totally irrelevant, basically. So they said, my skills are completely portable. They will work in any environment. And what my firm does for me is simply provide a context for me to shine. They didn't say that, but that's basically that's effectively what they meant. But then what Groysberg did was he actually went out and looked at what happened when people actually moved, when they actually tried to make themselves kind of portable. And he looked at people who were stars. And so he's written a book called Chasing Stars. He looked at people who were star analysts. So they were incredibly successful at their old firms. They were very highly rated. They made these analyst all-star teams and the like. And then he waited to see what happened after they moved to a different firm. And what he found with the vast majority of them was that their performance plummeted, that they actually did significantly worse at the new firm. And it wasn't just, he's arguing, a kind of mean reversion thing, although that had something to do with it. It was also that their knowledge was in some way firm-specific, that a lot of the skills they had were tied into the environments in which they were working. All of them, or the vast majority of them, worked on teams, so they were very closely tied to other people. They tended to rely on firm resources, so if you worked for a very high-profile firm, you had access to a lot more kind of knowledge and computing power than you might otherwise and the like. And so all of them were in some ways dependent on their environments, dependent on the places where they worked, in a sense that they themselves didn't understand, and in a sense that the people evaluating them didn't understand, right? Because they were getting paid huge sums of money and were actually not performing well at all in their new places. There was one interesting exception to this rule, by the way, which was women analysts. So women analysts, actually, their skills turned out to be completely portable. They actually were as good at the new firms as they were at the old firms. Now, this may be because women in general are just brilliant or whatever. There is probably an argument that to be a successful woman analyst, you probably do need to be further out on the curve than to be a successful male analyst. So there probably is some element of that. But Groysberg also theorizes that to be a successful woman analyst in a very male, sort of alpha male dominated culture, you probably need to have networks that reach outside the firm. That actually you probably need to have networks that are richer and deeper than just in your firm. And so they were able to rely on those even when they went outside it. The same thing, though, you can see the same phenomenon at work in terms of CEOs. So if you look at studies of CEO performance, what you tend to find is that CEOs who come to a company from outside that company's industry do significantly worse than CEOs who either come to the company from inside or who come to the company from another company in the same industry. And this again suggests that even if you are an exceptional CEO, it isn't necessarily a skill that you can kind of take everywhere. That actually there really is a tight connection between what you know and the environment you work in. So Groysberg also looked at General Electric. General Electric is famous for training executives, for kind of creating people who can go anywhere and sort of run a company and transform it. What he actually found was when former GE executives move within the same industry or a related industry, the companies they move to do, in fact, do exceptionally better. They are much more successful than their competitors and the like. But if you actually move, those who move to a company in a dissimilar industry, the performance of those companies plummets by about 30%. And it's actually even more interesting than this. If you move with other GE executives, so if you have a kind of team environment which the environment remains intact, those companies do much, much better. Their performance improves dramatically. But actually, if you move by yourself, again, performance shrinks. So, what's the conclusion here? Well, I think there are two important conclusions to take away. The first is that evaluating talent is a much harder and more complex job than we typically give it credit for. And that there are these tremendous biases that we are subject to that end up shaping our judgments, that we tend to overrate individual ability and to underrate the importance of chance and context. The second thing, though, is that if you can figure out a way, and as I said, using the streak tool is actually useful, if you can actually figure out a way to find those few truly exceptional performers, the results actually can be quite extraordinary. They can actually be transformative in some general sense. The catch, I think, is that they really are so rare that relying on your ability to find them, given all the hurdles we talked about, is actually probably a fool's game. And so I think the solution in some ways is to rethink the way we conceptualize talent, and to recognize that the ability to spot talent may itself be a scarce talent, right? We may not be able to do that. And that the goal in some ways is to do as good a job of finding talented people as you can, but to also build organizations in which the systems are actually stronger than the individuals within it. So that you want to build organizations that create the kind of environments in which people can thrive. That actually you want to build organizations in which ordinary people can actually do exceptionally well. And there are a whole host of tools that people rely on to do this. And then the second thing I think you need to do is you actually need to recognize that talent is not something that is necessarily fixed, that it can actually also be developed. And so creating organizations in which talent is actually kind of something that's seen as something to be worked on rather than just there is also essentially going to make you more successful. I mean, the fundamental problem we're dealing with is that to the extent that talent exists, it is very hard to forecast in advance. You know, it's sort of like that great line that the problem with life is that it has to be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward. And for the most part, I think the same thing is true of skill. So thank you very much. Thanks. I went on a little longer than I anticipated, but we've got about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So if you want to come to the mic, if there are any. Or if you're buried in whatever, you can just, I'm not sure if I can say that, but you can ask me and I'll, yeah, over here.
Hi. After you. Okay. Hi, Jim. The primary example of what you're talking about that I can think of is someone I know, Steve Jobs. 3 streaks, as my son reminded me, not just 2. But you have not mentioned, in addition to skill and context, doggedness or passion or determination. And they seem to me equally fundamental in how you evaluate it.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point. Because what I was really trying to get at here was less a kind of definition of skill in the strict sense than a kind of sense of can we evaluate it, can we essentially say that it exists. But I think that it's pretty clear that some element of talent actually is doggedness and persistence and the like. In fact, if you actually look at, I'll just give you an example. So there's a study that was done of Bell Labs, and this was actually the study where you had this immense gap where the top performers were 1,200% better than the rest of them. And they tried to evaluate these performers' characteristics. What were the fundamental characteristics that they had? And they actually tended to be, some of the things had to do with, intelligence and the like, but a lot of them were things like taking initiative, being a self-starter, being a self-manager, being able to essentially work in teams and the like. So there were actually these kind of what we sort of think of as maybe more personality characteristics, I think actually are really fundamentally important. And I think that's very true on the CEO level, but I think it's pretty much true across the board as well. And this is something that you really see in, this is an idea that's really at the heart of like Malcolm's book, Outliers, and it's also at the heart, or Jeff Colvin's book, Talent is Overrated. That the dimensions, the things that make up talent are actually about more than, say, just visionary ability or the like. And I certainly think Jobs, he would count as one, basically, who has all of those characteristics. I think that's right.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned 3M earlier, and then Google being another example of companies that kind of create more serendipitous kind of cultures. Do you see that as a conscious effort to kind of harness context and circumstance, and how effective is it?
Well, there is a problem where we only have a law of small numbers because actually there aren't many companies that have actually done it well at all, essentially. Now, what we know is that the companies that have done it have tended to be very successful. So that would include Google. It would include 3M. And I think that there are good reasons to, if you think about the theoretical connection, there are good reasons to think that creating an environment in which there is greater diversity of thought, in which individuals have a certain amount of time, so whether it be 15 or 20%, to work on what they kind of want to work on, that would actually probably be a way of sort of casting your net more widely and arriving at better answers. I think those are all reasons to think that this kind of works. But the fact that it worked in those circumstances doesn't necessarily mean that we know it will work everywhere. The one thing I would say is, I think that about 3M that's interesting is we do know that when they stopped doing it, that in some ways the company's performance actually plummeted. So when Jim McInerney, who now runs Boeing, went there, he instilled a very different kind of mentality, a much more bottom-line mentality, less experimental mentality, and the like. And I think that, and although initially it had a good effect on the bottom line, in the long run it ended up, I think, drying up much of the innovation chain. So I think that, and I think in terms of what we're talking about here, I think the principle really is that serendipity plays a major role. And to the extent that you can create environments in which serendipity can flourish, you're probably more likely to reach good results. If you think about the all-chain example, the car thing, effectively what those companies are doing is trying to send as many cars out as possible in as many different directions on the initiative of the individuals, and assuming that this is going to make it more likely that they'll find those roads that have gas stations on them. So I think that's actually a good idea. So over here.
I find it very interesting. The author of The Black Swan thinks that people in the hedge fund industry, by and large, have no skill and they're just taking advantage of a business model. But I have worked in that industry and I've seen talent, and I'm wondering what you think of survivorship bias in money management league tables, and what do you think of the most extraordinary talents in the hedge fund business? Do you think that they carry with them skills that are obviously proven by their statistical track record?
So, right. So survivorship bias is obviously a big problem in any kind of statistical evaluation, right? If you look at the performance of a group of companies or a group of hedge funds or mutual funds, you're looking at those that basically survived, and therefore you assume that they probably will have done better than those that didn't, because those that didn't went out of business or the guys quit or whatever. There's sort of a joke. I don't actually know if it's true, but there's a joke about beginner's luck. Basically, in gambling, why does everybody say, "Oh, I started out so great," and when I first started gambling, I was so successful, and the answer, some people think, is that if you didn't start off successful, you don't gamble anymore, basically, right? So that effectively it's just kind of a function of the fact that the only people you're talking to are people who liked it enough or whatever to keep doing it. And in the case of money management, and to some extent even corporate performance, it's a little different with companies because they obviously don't go out of business quite as rapidly as mutual funds. And it's a real issue. And it's a real issue in the hedge fund industry probably more than in the mutual fund industry because we don't have great statistics necessarily tracking all of these things. We also don't necessarily have great performance statistics and the like. So the other thing that happens in hedge funds, this is kind of a little insidery, but well, I'll tell you anyway, that a lot of what hedge funds do is simply, unlike mutual funds, they're able to do lots of different kinds of investing. So not only can they sell stocks short, which some mutual funds can now do, but they can invest across a wide range of asset classes and the like, across the world and so on. And so some of their success, to the extent it exists, probably just reflects the varying risks they're taking. They're just taking more risk, and so you could actually just duplicate that by basically just allocating assets in the same way they are without having any skill in picking stocks or picking individual bonds or anything along those lines. Having said all that, I think the streak evidence suggests that there probably are a small number of hedge fund managers, as with mutual fund managers, who do have some extraordinary amount of ability. Now, this is actually connected to the doggedness thing. One of the real tricks when it comes to money management is that ability doesn't reflect simply kind of I can pick good stocks or whatever. It also reflects certain kinds of psychological characteristics. Because obviously one of the real problems in money management is not just that you have to pick the stocks that are going to go up and not buy the ones that go down. You also have to be kind of gutsy enough to remain true to that conviction when the market moves against you, which will happen and does happen oftentimes quite dramatically. And that is an entire other level of skill. One that in some ways I'm not convinced can be taught. In some ways I do think that the ability to, as Rothschild said, buy when blood is in the streets, may actually be more innate than anything else. But that combination is very, very unusual, and I think it's one of the reasons why money management, successful money management, is pretty hard to come by. So, I do think there really is this fundamental, it's not even a paradox, it's just sort of travesty that individual investors pay large sums of money to managers, to mutual fund managers who are, it is unlikely giving them better results than they would get if they just put their money into an index fund. But, of course, the reality with all of us is we all think we can pick the one guy who actually really is the great money manager. So the fact that we know they're out there, or at least think they're out there, actually convinces us that we can do that. It's just sort of this weird thing. We know we're not talented ourselves, but we are convinced that we can recognize the people who are. And I think that really is it plays a huge role across the board in a lot of different environments. So, yeah.
Hi, this isn't about this talk
Totally
per
cool.
se, but a financial page piece I don't
Sure.
really see you writing right now. And I appreciate if this is either like the most or least appropriate place to ask this.
Oh, no.
I also appreciate this is not officially your position, but this is my fourth New Yorker event. This festival, which is the fourth time now I've seen this iPad app.
Okay.
And I have to say, it seems like a lot more thought was put into this ad than the actual business model for distributing this, because as far as I'm aware, it's $5 an issue, free app, $250 a year. That seems preposterous. And as a subscriber,
Now,
I'm here with my family. We all subscribe. Are we expected to spend $1,000?
No, I actually, it's a good question. It's a good question. I'm not going to say anything that's going to get me in trouble with the business people who I love. But actually, the real reason why I can't say is because I don't actually know the answer. So when they said the iPad app was $5, I assumed that meant it was $5 for, if you subscribed, I assumed it meant it was $5 for the year. But then I was told then I don't know. You're saying it's not true. I have no idea. And the only thing I will say, let me put it this way. I will say that business models for the new world, digital world, are evolving, and and we have not figured out exactly how to. I think we are trying to figure out how to do it, and that's all. I actually don't really know. I mean, the one thing I will say is there is a real, and I think there'll be much more of this going forward. There is a value added to the to the app in the sense that there are going to be things that I think are going to be produced especially for it and the like. And so there is going to be a value add, but that's all I can say.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. And I'm just saying, I guess I knew you didn't come up with this strategy. I wasn't asking you to defend
Right.
it. It was more about it seemed really just not sustainable to me. And I was curious if you could just speak to what might strike you as a sustainable.
Well, it's an interesting question. I actually don't know that I have a good answer to that. I mean, I actually think. Especially, I actually can't really speak to the iPad thing because I don't have one, and I have not thought hard enough, I think, about what's going to work on it. I mean, I think that the challenge we all face, obviously, is in the magazine world is, well, there are two challenges. I mean, one is obviously the migration to free and people's expectations of free. But the interesting thing about that is that in some ways, at least up to this moment, that hasn't really affected the magazine to any large extent. I mean, if you look at our circulation, it's around where it was, 2 years ago, or whatever, and it's still over 1 million, and I don't think there's any evidence of it dropping. Now, we're in probably an unusual position because of the nature of the content, because we're so awesome. I'm just kidding about that. I'm just kidding. It's just longer articles or less writing or whatever. Yeah. But I also think, and a lot of people I know, a lot of my friends really disagree with our strategy on this, but I actually tend to think it's a great one, which is, that our content isn't all available for free. That you do have to subscribe. And I wish the digital interface worked a little better on the web. But I think that that model is for us, I think, has been a very, very good one. And I like the fact that my columns are available, but I think it makes sense that, the longer thing. In terms of the sustainability, I mean, I think the issue has to be I think it's going to be some combination of paid and advertising. So I don't actually believe it's going to be a purely advertising-supported medium in the digital world. And so I think some combination of that is necessary. Now, I don't know enough about the economics of the iPad to be able to say anything more than that. But, I mean, that one of the things that's worth keeping in mind from a reader's point of view, even though it has nothing to do with your experience, is that the real thing that's happened in the last few years, or last couple of years, is really that advertising has really just plummeted. It's a very curious kind of state of affairs. I mean, it's not that curious because advertisers always panic during recessions, but it's curious in the sense of the same number of people are reading these products, and that's pretty much across the board. But advertisers are just less interested in them, and obviously that has to do with a lot of different things. But I think that that's really the challenge we're facing right now. So, do we need to go? 5. Okay, one more. Thanks.
I don't have to say.
Oh, okay. Actually, we've got 5 minutes. We can take a couple more.
Okay. Maybe a little less provocative than the previous question, but when
Get me
I
in a
was
little less trouble, I hope.
hopefully straightforward. When I was introduced to the concept of corporations, companies, enterprises revert to the mean in their behavior, one of the concepts was that when you're, as an employee, when you're looking for job opportunities, you should look sort of as like a hockey stick, and you should look at where companies are underperforming, and then you can step in and have an opportunity to make a difference. And I don't know if that is consistent with the view that you were talking about streaks.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's actually, I think that actually is, from a tactical point of view, quite smart in some ways. Now, the challenge you face in doing that is that you don't know exactly where the company may be on the verge of mean reverting, or it may be on the verge of basically going out of business. And so, there is a challenge in that regard. But I think that one place where you can really see what you're talking about is our CEOs. So there are a lot of studies that that try to demonstrate that CEO. One of the interesting things about kind of the academic literature on business is that there's there hasn't been as much as you expect, but there have been a lot of attempts recently to try to demonstrate that CEOs make a big difference in companies, right? Mainly to try to justify their huge salaries. So, but as it turns out, this is something people haven't really had not looked that hard at, and even now is something that's still kind of in its nascent terms. But one of the places where they tend to look at it are places where CEOs are called in to replace, where someone's been fired or whatever. But one of the problems you run into there is really this mean reversion problem, basically, right? Because if you're a CEO, if you can pick a company that has been doing badly but still has certain kinds of, strengths, that can get it back, that's a great place to go because you have a very, very good chance of turning that a much better chance of turning that company around. And so as a result, you're going to look better. And I think that some of the literature that demonstrates that CEOs make a big difference is really just an artifact of that. It's just an artifact of the fact that it's the opposite of beginner's luck. Companies that are really struggling are obviously more likely to call in outside CEOs and the like. So I think that actually is a good, it seems like good advice if you can, as long as you figure out that you're not on the true downward slope, I guess. So, okay, last two.
Thanks for your talk. It's great.
Sure.
Just in terms of where talent actually matters, can you speak to how this can be used or should be used to determine compensation?
Yeah, great question.
I know this is a big.
Yeah, that's obviously the huge question. So it actually works in two ways. You could if you think about it. So the first is obviously that if you buy the argument that I made that there are a few performers at the tail end who actually do in fact can make enormous differences. Then it's an argument for paying those people exceptionally well, if you can identify them. And I think that obviously makes a certain amount of sense. But I think the more important lesson is that paying people enormous amounts in advance is almost certainly a mistake. And that tying compensation to long-term performance rather than to short-term performance is really the only sensible way to do it. So, and that's true. One reason why you don't want to tie it to short-term performance, especially with executives, is because you give them an incentive to manipulate the numbers or to do certain things that are bad. But set that aside. What we also know is that, from what I said, is obviously that that it's only over the long term that you actually know whether or not this reflects any real ability or not. And so, tying, again, compensation to those kinds of measures, I think, is much more important. I also think companies need to do a much better job of indexing their compensation to industry. So this has always been one of the very peculiar things about the way the CEO labor market works, which is that you essentially get rewarded if the S&P 500 rises, and you don't get rewarded if it, well, you win either way, obviously. But that your compensation is really, in large part, you benefit from things that you had absolutely nothing to do with. So I think indexing compensation to other bigger metrics that try to measure to some degree circumstance is absolutely appropriate. And I would say in places like the oil industry or the like, not tying your compensation in some ways to not tying your compensation to things like oil prices, right? So making it independent of exogenous events, again, seems to make perfect sense. Now, I can say all this, but the reality is it's going to make almost no difference because, and it's not just because I think boards of directors are controlled by CEOs, as a lot of people have suggested. I think it's a couple things. I think it's also that the power of this faith in innate ability is very, very strong. People believe in their own exceptionalness and therefore like to believe that others are exceptional as well, especially since boards are often made up of CEOs. And then the second thing, which is in some ways even more problematic, but is that I think no one ever says this, but I think if you actually look at the math, I think what a lot of people say, boards are basically saying to themselves is, okay, maybe he's just in the middle there, right? Maybe he's just some ordinary guy, right? And maybe he's on the tail end. We think there's a chance he's on the tail end. The only way we can get him is to pay some, exorbitant salary, just because of the way they see it. And if he is in the middle, we lose whatever, $12 million, which in the context of a big company is essentially nothing. And if he is on the right, on the tail end, then then he's an enormous bargain. So that's the way I think people tend to think of it. One thing they don't ever seem to consider is that he might actually destroy the company. But when we think about skill, we very rarely think of maybe he has bad skill, maybe he has negative skill, even though it's very clear that some CEOs do. So I think that those are all things that should be done. And I don't know. Well, it's something I write about a lot. So I'd love to see it happen. So
thank you.
Yeah. Last one.
Yes, I want to go back to what you were saying before about blood in the streets.
Yeah.
And the question of whether or not opportunism as a real talent, exploiting opportunity, including the biased thinking of others, including fortunate contexts, is more of an important talent in determining outcome than many other talents. And one other thing, by the way.
Sorry.
I own a great deal of Apple stock, and I'm definitely not selling Apple.
That's it. Apple to me seems like a genuine success story. I actually think that's a great way of putting it. Opportunism. And maybe the bias to action that they had in Search of Excellence is maybe there's something to that. It's not as obvious as it sounds. I think it plays a huge role probably both in business and in investing. I think in investing, the opportunism probably, as you said, takes a couple of forms. One is the ability to recognize opportunities. That sounds kind of obvious, but the easy position to take in investing is just to be a contrarian. But being a mindless contrarian is disastrous because we know over time, the market is actually very, very hard to beat. I think the bigger challenge when it comes to opportunism is probably has to do not just with recognizing opportunities, but being willing to act on them in a psychological sense. And so, we can go back and forth on this, but it is interesting on a very kind of anecdotal level that if you actually look at the psychological characteristics of very high-profile successful investors, there are certain things they do seem to have in common, and one of the things they do seem to have in common is a certain kind of, I don't know if patience is the right word, but there is a much longer-term perspective, and there also is a kind of psychological distance that is interesting and somewhat unnerving, actually, to be around. That is to say, there is a way in which they seem much more immune to the sways of emotion than I think most of us are. If you think the classic, we all have experienced this. We know individual investors trade far more often than they should. We know they tend to get out at the top. Get out at the bottom and stay in at the top. And just from any of you who have money in the market, you can remember what it felt like in March of '09. When it basically seemed like the world was collapsing, right? That was the time to buy, we now know. And I think there were good fundamental reasons to think it was. But on a psychological basis, just to be able to pull that off, you needed a lot more than being able to say to yourself, this is a good decision. You really, I mean, you needed some kind of, opportunism is a good word, and I think it's just a hard thing to come by. So, need to go? All right. Thank you very much.